There are players who are explained through statistics, others through rings, and then there are those who don't fit into either category because what happened on the court was only a small part of the problem. Dennis Rodman belongs to that bizarre group, the one made up of guys who seem built out of controversy, noise, gestures no one ever fully understands. For years, many people believed they had already seen everything from him, that he was just provocation, excess, circus, but that reading always falls short. Because before the character, before the hair, before the headlines, there was something much quieter. A man who never quite found his place, not even when he reached the top. This is not a story about rebounds or championships, nor is it an excuse or a settling of scores. It is the journey of someone who spent his life trying not to disappear, even when the entire world couldn't stop looking at him. In the early 1980s, Dennis Rodman had absolutely nothing connecting him to a sports career. He lived in the Dallas area with no education on track, no team, no support network. He stood just over 5 feet 7 inches tall, didn't stand out in any sport, and carried a persistent feeling of arriving late to everything. While his sisters were already shining in college basketball, he barely managed to hold on to odd jobs to survive. One of those jobs was as a night janitor at Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport. Long shifts, solitude, mechanical routine. In that context, an episode occurred that marked a breaking point. Rodman was arrested after stealing watches from a store in the airport. The charges were eventually dropped and there was no conviction, but the experience was enough to leave him with an uncomfortable certainty. If he kept going down that path, the ending was obvious, a point of no return. And then something happened that followed no plan and no sporting logic. Between the ages of 19 and 20, his body changed abruptly. He grew almost 8 inches in a very short time, eventually surpassing 6 feet 7 inches. The adjustment was awkward, even painful, but that physical change opened a door that until then had not existed. For the first time, basketball stopped feeling like foreign territory. An acquaintance convinced him to try out at Cook County College, a community college in Texas. Rodman had no technical training or prior resume, but he did have something that couldn't be taught, an almost desperate intensity. The result was immediate. In his first college season, he averaged more than 17 points and 13 rebounds per game, numbers that drew attention despite the modest context of the program. Cook County offered him a full scholarship. At 20 years old, when many were already defining their future, he was just learning how to stand on the court. That momentum, however, didn't solve everything. Academic problems appeared quickly and Rodman dropped out of college before long. He returned to Dallas without a degree, without a team, and without certainties, but something had changed forever. He now knew that a possible way out existed. It wasn't a promise of success, not by any means. It was barely a direction, and at that moment, that was enough. The return to Dallas was anything but heroic. Dennis came back with the feeling that he had wasted the only opportunity that had ever presented itself to him. Without an education, without a team, and without a clear direction, he began to turn into one more burden inside a household that was already operating at its limit. His mother, exhausted and with no margin left, ended up kicking him out. He was around 20 years old and once again he was alone. For a while he survived however he could, bouncing between minor jobs without stability and with the certainty that the margin for error had been reduced to the minimum. He would later say himself that at that point prison stopped seeming like a distant possibility and began to feel like a probable destination. There was no polished talent, there were no contacts, there was no plan, just a big body that still didn't know how to use itself. Basketball, even so, kept showing up as a persistent idea, almost like an obsession. Rodman trained in a disorganized way without refined technique, but with an energy that never went out. He didn't know how to shoot well, he didn't understand systems, he didn't have tactical awareness. What he did have was an almost visceral relationship with rebounding and physical effort. He was clumsy but insistent, raw but tireless. In that context, Lone Race Man appeared, an assistant coach at Southeastern Oklahoma State University, a small NAIA school in the city of Durant. Race Man had heard rumors about a late-blooming, intense, unpolished center who had briefly passed through Cook County. He was not a safe bet, not even close. At best, he was a curiosity. Even so, he decided to give him a chance. For Rodman, Southeastern was not a leap toward the elite. It was a refuge, a place without media pressure, without external expectations, where he could make mistakes and learn without being immediately discarded. He arrived without a name, without hype, and with more doubts than certainties. But for the first time, someone was willing to teach him the game from scratch, even knowing that the biological clock was already running against him. Southeastern Oklahoma State was not the kind of place where stars are made. It was a small university, the kind that doesn't appear on basketball's important maps, much less in serious conversations about the future of the NBA, and precisely because of that, it worked. That's where Dennis Rodman arrived without external expectations, without press, without the obligation to look like something he still wasn't. The leap was immediate. Between 1983 and 1986, Rodman went from being an improvised project to becoming a competitive anomaly. He averaged around 25 points and more than 15 rebounds per game for 3 consecutive seasons. It wasn't just volume, it was constant presence, wear and tear, repetition. While others rested, he kept jumping. While the game cooled off, he kept it uncomfortable. This is where rebounding stopped being a statistic and became a language of its own. Rodman didn't wait for the ball to come to him, he went after it. He collided, shoved, anticipated. He learned to read trajectories before the shot left the shooter's hands, not because someone taught him on a whiteboard, but because he needed it in order to exist within the game. Every rebound was a way of justifying his place on the court. During those years, he was selected as an NAIA All-American for 3 straight seasons and led the team to a combined record of 74 wins and 22 losses. To this day, he remains the university's all-time leading rebounder by such a wide margin that no one has come close to matching it. In an environment where nobody was watching, he began to build something that didn't depend on external applause. It was also there that the first out-of-script Rodman appeared. He walked around campus with coins in his ears, trained without worrying too much about fitting in, did things that had no clear explanation. It wasn't a marketing strategy, it was simply a way of being, of marking territory in a world that had always asked him to adapt. The uncomfortable fact for the system was his age. When he finished his college career, Rodman was 25 years old. By professional basketball standards, that was late. Too late. Most players were already entering the league or being discarded. He was just beginning to truly learn how to play. But the context worked in his favor. Nobody expected anything. And when nobody expects anything, anything that breaks the mold becomes impossible to ignore. In the 1986 draft, Dennis Rodman was selected only in the second round with the 27th pick by the Detroit Pistons. He didn't arrive as a promise or as a long-term project. He arrived rather as a strange piece, hard to label, on a team that already knew exactly who it was. Detroit didn't need another star. Isaiah Thomas, Joe DeMars, and Bill Laimbeer were already there. What it needed was someone willing to do the work nobody wanted to do every day without asking for the spotlight. In that harsh ecosystem, Rodman fit in immediately, not because he understood everything, but because he accepted his role without questioning it. Rebound, defend, wear people down. That was enough. Coming off the bench during his rookie season, he played almost every game with limited minutes, but with an energy that could be felt even when he didn't touch the ball. He averaged just over 6 points and 4 rebounds in barely 15 minutes a night, modest numbers that didn't fully explain his real impact. Detroit won more than 50 games and reached the Eastern Conference Finals, where they ran into Larry Bird's Boston Celtics. It was in that series, intense and loaded with tension, that Rodman was exposed off the court for the first time. In public statements, he questioned Bird's stature and suggested that his status had to do with more than just basketball. The comment sparked an immediate media storm. Rodman apologized quickly, understood the mistake, and returned to the only thing he knew how to do: play. The episode ended there, but it set a precedent. He was not going to be a silent player, he was going to cause trouble. In his second season, his role grew. He played all 82 games, averaged more than 11 points and nearly 9 rebounds, and became a regular presence in the rotation of a team that was already thinking big. The Pistons reached the 1988 Finals, but fell to the Los Angeles Lakers in a tight series that left one clear feeling: they were close, but it still wasn't enough. The definitive leap came in the 1988-89 season. Rodman established himself as one of the best defenders in the league, was selected to the NBA first-team All-Defense, and led the league in field goal percentage. Detroit tore through the playoffs, swept Boston, lost only 2 games before the finals, and took revenge on the Lakers with a historic sweep. Rodman won his first ring without changing his role. The following year, with Rick Mahorn's departure, he took on even more responsibility. He was named Defensive Player of the Year in the 1989-90 season, participated in his first All-Star game, and once again made the all-defensive first team. Detroit repeated as champions after defeating Portland in the finals, becoming back-to-back champions. Rodman was now a 2-time champion, recognized by the league and respected by his peers without ever having asked for the ball in decisive moments. In Detroit, he found something he had never had before: a clear place. No one demanded that he be someone else. No one asked him to lead through ego. They asked for effort, focus, and absolute commitment, and that for the first time matched exactly what he knew how to do. With the titles came consequences as well. The Bad Boys label wasn't a friendly tag or a marketing nickname. It was an identity built on hits, friction, provocation, and a competitive ethic that constantly brushed against the limit. In that climate, Dennis Rodman didn't just fit in, he became a central piece of the machine. But that fit came at a cost. In the early 1990s, Detroit was no longer the team that surprised people, it was the team everyone wanted to dethrone. Every night was played like a preemptive revenge, and Rodman responded with the same fuel that had brought him there. Inexhaustible energy and a total willingness to put his body on the line. In the 1989-90 season, already a starter for much of the year, he was named Defensive Player of the Year for the first time, not because of charisma or narrative, but because no one did the dirty work with that level of consistency. The second ring, won against Portland, fully cemented Detroit's image as an impenetrable block. Rodman wasn't the face of the team, but he was one of its exposed nerves. He defended anyone, switched assignments without complaint, and seemed to enjoy the physical wear and tear. Winning wasn't elegant, it was effective, and for him, that was enough. The following season pushed that logic even further. In 1990-91, Rodman was again named Defensive Player of the Year and began to carry greater responsibility within the team structure. He was no longer just the specialist off the bench, he was a stable starter with heavy minutes and specific tasks against the opposing stars. The problem was that the body and the mind don't always evolve at the same pace. Detroit kept winning, but cracks were beginning to show. The constant battles against Chicago, especially against Michael Jordan, left marks. The accumulated wear of 3 consecutive finals and brutally physical seasons began to be felt. In 1991, the Bulls finally broke the cycle and eliminated the Pistons in the playoffs. It wasn't just a sporting defeat, it was the end of an era. Even so, Rodman had his best individual season immediately afterward. In 1991-92, he led the league with 18.7 rebounds per game, the highest average since the days of Wilt Chamberlain. He won the first of 7 consecutive NBA rebounding titles and was selected to the All-NBA team for the first time. In terms of performance, he was at an absolute peak. But winning that way comes with a price. The constant demands, the identity built around conflict, and the paternal figure of Chuck Daly holding everything in balance were all beginning to disappear at the same time. Detroit was no longer invincible, and Rodman, even as he continued to dominate on the court, was starting to lose the emotional weight that had made everything before possible. The problem wasn't losing. The problem was what remained when winning stopped being enough. Chuck Daly's departure after the 1991-92 season was a blow that couldn't be measured in statistics. For Dennis Rodman, Daly wasn't just the coach who knew how to use him, he was the figure who had given him containment, clear boundaries, and a place without conditions. When Daly stepped down and Detroit began to retool, something essential also came undone off the court. The team was already coming off an early playoff exit and an accumulated wear that could be felt in every decision. Rodman, even while leading the league in rebounds, began to disconnect. He missed team activities, isolated himself, played with a different kind of energy. The structure that had held him up was gone, and no one seemed willing to fill that space. At the same time, his personal life entered a spiral. His relationship with Annie Bakes broke down definitively, and the fight for custody of his daughter became a constant source of conflict. For someone who had grown up with abandonment as an original mark, that loss reopened wounds that had never fully closed. Rodman began to feel without belonging again, even inside the locker room. In November 1992, the episode that laid everything bare took place. After a concerned friend filed a report, police found Rodman in the parking lot of the Palace of Auburn Hills inside his truck with a loaded rifle. There were no shots fired and no injuries, but the message was impossible to ignore. The fear that he might disconnect from life itself was intense. Rodman was taken for psychiatric evaluation, and the incident became public immediately. Days later, he himself would explain that it wasn't an isolated impulse, but the result of feeling completely lost. He had titles, recognition, and a secure place in the league, but he had lost the two figures that sustained him, the coach who functioned as a father and the family he was trying to build. That episode didn't close anything. It wasn't an ending or a resolution, it was a rupture. From that point on, Rodman understood that he couldn't keep being the version that had worked in Detroit. The problem was that he still didn't know which version would come next. The trade to the Spurs, finalized before the 1993-94 season, was read as one last elegant opportunity. A change of scenery, a stable franchise, a dominant figure like David Robinson alongside him. On the court, Dennis responded immediately. He averaged 17.3 rebounds per game, led the league, and once again became, without debate, the most decisive rebounder in basketball. San Antonio won 55 games. The impact was real, tangible, impossible to deny, but not everything was good. Rodman began to pile up fines for ejections, technical fouls, and episodes that had nothing to do with the game itself. The most remembered was the headbutt to Stacey King in a game against Chicago, a scene that made it clear that the tension was no longer staying within the lines. Even so, when he played, he delivered, and that made everything harder to manage. Off the court, the exposure grew. His relationship with Madonna turned him into permanent tabloid and camera material. Rodman wasn't trying to hide, he didn't seem to care about the noise either. The attention worked as fuel and distraction at the same time. Meanwhile, on the hardwood, he kept producing. The contrast was evident. The more chaotic everything around him seemed, the clearer his basketball value became. The season ended abruptly in the playoffs. San Antonio fell in the first round, and frustration lingered not because of a lack of talent, but because of a sense of disorder that no one managed to channel. Rodman had shown that he could elevate a team on his own in terms of physical and competitive impact, but he had also made it clear that he had no intention of moderating himself to do it. The trade to the Spurs, finalized before the 1993-94 season, was read as one last elegant opportunity. A change of scenery, a stable franchise, a dominant figure like David Robinson alongside him. On the court, Dennis responded immediately. He averaged 17.3 rebounds per game, led the league, and once again became, without debate, the most decisive rebounder in basketball. San Antonio won 55 games. The impact was real, tangible, impossible to deny, but not everything was good. Rodman began to pile up fines for ejections, technical fouls, and episodes that had nothing to do with the game itself. The most remembered was the headbutt to Stacey King in a game against Chicago, a scene that made it clear that the tension was no longer staying within the lines. Even so, when he played, he delivered, and that made everything harder to manage. Off the court, the exposure grew. His relationship with Madonna turned him into permanent tabloid and camera material. Rodman wasn't trying to hide, he didn't seem to care about the noise either. The attention worked as fuel and distraction at the same time. Meanwhile, on the hardwood, he kept producing. The contrast was evident. The more chaotic everything around him seemed, the clearer his basketball value became. The season ended abruptly in the playoffs. San Antonio fell in the first round, and frustration lingered, not because of a lack of talent, but because of a sense of disorder that no one managed to channel. Rodman had shown that he could elevate a team on his own in terms of physical and competitive impact, but he had also made it clear that he had no intention of moderating himself to do it. The second season in San Antonio no longer came with the benefit of the doubt. By then, Dennis Rodman was still the best rebounder in the world, but the context had changed. The franchise decided to tighten its internal framework. Greg Popovich took over as general manager, and Bob Hill replaced John Lucas on the bench. The message was clear. Flexibility was over. Rodman reacted the way he always had when he felt someone was trying to domesticate him. Fines for being late, sanctions for absences, head-on clashes with the coaching staff. The episode in which he threw ice toward Bob Hill during a preseason game was an unequivocal sign that coexistence was broken. The club's response was immediate: suspension, forced leave, and an increasingly heavy atmosphere. Even so, when he returned to play, the impact was unquestionable. In 1994-95, he once again led the league with 16.8 rebounds per game, and the Spurs closed the regular season with the best record in the NBA. The contradiction was total. The team won when he was on the court, but the internal cost became impossible to sustain. The playoffs finished breaking everything apart. In the series against the Lakers, Rodman starred in a scene that became a symbol of the definitive rupture. In the middle of the game, he took off his sneakers, sat on the sideline, and stopped participating in the huddles. It wasn't an isolated tantrum. It was a gesture of absolute disconnection. San Antonio suspended him, and although he returned for the following games, the relationship was already dead. The chaos, which before could be read as tolerable eccentricity, stopped being funny. It was no longer functional provocation or controlled noise. It was a structural problem. The Spurs understood there was no way to move forward with him in that state. Rodman, for his part, made it clear that he wasn't going to give in. The trade to Chicago in mid-1995 was a cold decision. The Bulls had lost Horace Grant and urgently needed someone to handle rebounding, defense, and physical wear. Dennis Rodman fit that equation perfectly. From the first day, it was clear that the balance was different. Michael Jordan and Scottie Pippen concentrated the competitive authority. Phil Jackson organized the chaos with a mix of clear rules and controlled freedom. Rodman wasn't asked to change who he was. He was asked to do what he knew how to do within a framework that was not negotiable, and for the first time in in a long while, he accepted. The impact was immediate. He arrived during the 1995 playoffs, and by the following season had become a central piece of the machine. Chicago finished 72-10 in the regular season, the best record in history at that time. Rodman led the league in rebounding with 14.9 per game and was selected to the NBA All-Defensive First Team. He didn't need plays drawn up for him. His influence was in every second possession, every loose ball, every collision that disrupted the opponent. What stood out wasn't just the performance, but the coexistence. On a team full of egos, Rodman found a clear place. Jordan set the competitive standard, Pippen sustained the structure, and Jackson let each piece breathe within the system. Rodman could be eccentric, provocative, even unpredictable, as long as the commitment on the court was total, and it was. Chicago won the title in 1996 against Seattle and repeated in 1997 and 1998. 3 consecutive championships with Rodman as an absolute specialist, without asking for clutch shots or extra media attention inside the locker room. Even his most talked about escapades, like the lightning trip to Las Vegas in the middle of the season, were tolerated because performance justified the exception. The ecosystem worked because everyone knew exactly what to expect from the others. It wasn't a redemption or a personal transformation. It was something simpler and rarer. The right place at the right time. In Chicago, Rodman didn't have to be contained or corrected. He had to be useful, and in that role, he was irreplaceable. With the titles came concessions as well. In Chicago, no one pretended that Dennis Rodman would get his inner life in order. As long as he kept delivering, the system absorbed everything else. That logic allowed scenes that in any other context would have been unacceptable, and even so, didn't break the balance. During the 1996-97 season, Rodman once again led the league in rebounding, this time with 16.1 per game, and was key to the trio's second ring. But the wear was already visible. His body accumulated hits, his energy had more erratic peaks, and media attention began to run parallel to basketball. Professional wrestling, with appearances at WCW events in the middle of the NBA season, was the clearest example of that double life that Chicago tolerated reluctantly. The third championship in 1998 came in a different atmosphere. The team was crossed by internal tensions, the future was uncertain, and Rodman no longer had the same physical margin. Even so, when he was on the court, he delivered. He defended, rebounded, wore opponents down. It wasn't his best statistical year, but he remained functional for a team that played every game as if it were the last. Chicago was reaching the end of its cycle, and Rodman was too. Unfortunately, the sense of that cosmic balance couldn't be sustained much longer. When the final ring was secured and the dynasty broke apart, Rodman didn't leave any different from how he'd arrived. Not more ordered, not calmer, he left the same. The difference was that, for a while, that had been enough to win. By that point, Dennis Rodman no longer separated who he was from what he showed. There was no outside of the character. The spectacle stopped being a distraction and became pure, hard identity. If everything was going to be watched, then he would decide how. In 1996, he published his autobiography, Bad As I Wanna Be. The title wasn't empty provocation, it was a declaration. In the book, he spoke without filters about his intimate relationships, drinking, violence, fame, and emptiness. He didn't try to justify himself or arrange the story to make it digestible. He told things as he felt them, even when that left him badly exposed. The message was simple and brutal. He wasn't asking for understanding, he was marking territory. That same year, he took the performance one step further. He appeared at a press conference dressed in a white wedding gown, makeup included, announcing that he was marrying himself. The scene traveled the world. For some, it was a joke. For others, an unnecessary provocation. For Rodman, it was a way of saying that he was no longer going to explain himself under anyone else's rules. The body, the clothes, the hair dyed impossible colors, the piercings and tattoos stopped being accessories and became a bizarre language. His relationship with Carmen Electra finished cementing that constant exposure. They met in 1998, married that same year in Las Vegas, and became an omnipresent couple in pop culture. Red carpets, magazine covers, reality shows, shared excesses. The relationship was intense, chaotic, and brief. The divorce came the following year. There was no hidden scandal. Everything was public, like almost everything in that stage of his life. At the same time, Rodman crossed, without asking permission, into another territory of spectacle. Professional wrestling. He signed with WCW and joined the NWO, appearing at televised events while he was still an active NBA player. He even took part in a main event match alongside Hulk Hogan at Bash at the Beach in 1997. For the league, it was a constant inconvenience. For Rodman, another way to stretch the limits of what was allowed. He also spoke openly about his sexuality, rejecting rigid labels and unsettling a sports environment that was still inflexible in that regard. He does not consider himself gay, but says he likes going to bars exclusively for the LGBTQ+ community, as well as watching drag queen shows. He didn't do it as a banner or as a dramatic confession. He did it with the same logic as everything else, refusing to be boxed in. The spectacle wasn't a cry for help or a distraction strategy, it was a response. After years of trying to adapt, Rodman had found a different way to exist without asking permission. The problem is that living as a character comes at a price, and that price isn't always paid in headlines. When Chicago ended, there was no ceremony or orderly transition. The closure was abrupt. Dennis Rodman became a free agent in the summer of 1998, and for the first time in years, the context stopped being designed for him. There was no longer a system willing to absorb the noise in exchange for results. What remained was the player, the body, and the reputation. The first attempt was with the Los Angeles Lakers during the 1998-99 season. On paper, the idea seemed logical. Pair Shaquille O'Neal with someone who could clean the glass and put his body on the line. In practice, it lasted just 23 games. Rodman arrived out of shape with disciplinary issues and intermittent energy. There were rebounds, yes, but also more of the same: ejections, absences, and a constant feeling of disconnection. The Lakers released him before the playoffs without much explanation. The experiment was a failure. The next stop was Dallas in the 1999-2000 season. There, the contrast was even more evident: a young team without a solid structure trying to integrate a veteran who could no longer wanted to adapt. He played only 12 games. In some, he showed flashes of what he had been. In others, he simply looked out of place. Mark Cuban, the Mavericks owner, decided to waive him before the season ended. There was no public conflict or major scandal, just the bitter reminder that time had passed. That was, without any official announcement, the end of his NBA career. Rodman didn't organize a farewell or speak about retirement in solemn terms. He simply stopped being there. At 38 years old, with 5 championships, multiple defensive awards, and 7 consecutive rebounding titles, his time as a player faded out. Once outside the NBA, Dennis Rodman didn't disappear. Quite the opposite. Without games, without seasons, without locker rooms, his public presence intensified. Fame, freed from basketball, began to move along other tracks. Television, tabloids, reality shows, interviews that mixed confession and spectacle. Rodman was no longer news for what he did on the court, but for the simple fact of being there. He took part in shows like Celebrity Rehab and Celebrity Apprentice, the latter hosted by Donalcio Trampolin himself, where his erratic personality coexisted with a vulnerability that was increasingly less concealed. On camera, he talked about excesses and about a life that seemed unable to find rhythm outside of competition. The television format exposed him, but it also gave him something he had always sought: attention without conditions. That constant exposure came accompanied by problematic episodes: arrests for driving under the influence, hospitalizations, public relapses. They were a sequence of warnings that repeated themselves in different forms. Each appearance seemed to confirm an uncomfortable idea. Without basketball as a daily structure, everything became more unstable. Even so, Rodman never adopted the role of the nostalgic ex-player. He didn't speak from the before or from melancholy over what was lost. He remained frontal, unpredictable, sometimes disoriented. Fame didn't function as a replacement for the game. It functioned as a stage, a place to keep existing without having to explain too much. In that period, his figure remained suspended in an ambiguous zone. For some, he was a warning about the costs of excess. For others, a survivor who stayed standing however he could. The truth is that the noise no longer had a sporting counterweight to organize it, and when fame is left alone without an anchor, it begins to show its most fragile side. After North Korea, the noise died down, but the wear remained. Dennis Rodman began to appear less in major headlines and more in small news items, the kind that don't surprise but do worry. More problems with alcohol, stints in rehabilitation centers, confused statements, long silences. There was no definitive collapse, but there was no real stability either. It was a constant back and forth. His body, punished by years of collisions, also began to take its toll. Knees, back, hips, chronic pain that didn't resolve with rest or miracle surgeries. For someone who had built his identity through the physical, that limitation was more than an inconvenience. It was a loss of language. Movement, which for decades had been his way of being in the world, no longer responded the same way. Loneliness became more visible in that context. Without a team, without routine, without an external structure to set schedules and goals, Rodman was left facing something he had always avoided: empty time, public appearances mixed with periods of total isolation, friends who came and went, intermittent support, no permanent network. Even so, something never went completely out. From time to time, he reappeared in interviews where he spoke with rawness about his mistakes without makeup or rehearsed speeches, not as an apology or a redemptive confession, but as a plain account. He admitted relapses, acknowledged fragilities, accepted that there were no clear answers. That honesty, uncomfortable and sometimes messy, functioned as a minimal form of resistance. Rodman didn't become an example of classic self-improvement nor a closed tragedy. He remained in an intermediate, irregular human zone. Surviving, in his case, did not mean putting everything in order, but moving forward with the tools he had. And although pain and loneliness remained, so did he. Without guarantees, without promises, but still standing. After North Korea, the noise died down, but the where remained. Dennis Rodman began to appear less in major headlines and more in small news items, the kind that don't surprise but do worry, more problems with alcohol, stints in rehabilitation centers, confused statements, long silences. There was no definitive collapse, but there was no real stability either. It was a constant back and forth. His body, punished by years of collisions, also began to take its toll. Knees, back, hips, chronic pain that didn't resolve with rest or miracle surgeries. For someone who had built his identity through the physical, that limitation was more than an inconvenience. It was a loss of language. Movement, which for decades had been his way of being in the world, no longer responded the same way. Loneliness became more visible in that context. Without a team, without routine, without an external structure to set schedules and goals, Rodman was left facing something he'd always avoided: empty time. Public appearances mixed with periods of total isolation, friends who came and went, intermittent support, no permanent network. Even so, something never went completely out. From time to time, he reappeared in interviews where he spoke with rawness about his mistakes without makeup or rehearsed speeches. Not as an apology or a redemptive confession, but as a plain account. He admitted relapses, acknowledged fragilities, accepted that there were no clear answers. That honesty, uncomfortable and sometimes messy, functioned as a minimal form of resistance. Rodman did not become an example of classic self-improvement nor a closed tragedy. He remained in an intermediate, irregular human zone. Surviving, in his case, did not mean putting everything in order, but moving forward with the tools he had. And although pain and loneliness remained, so did he, without guarantees, without promises, but still standing. Dennis Rodman was never an easy story to organize. Not for the NBA, not for the media, not for those who tried to live alongside him. He won everything that can be won without being the face of a team. He dominated games without asking for the ball. He was indispensable without being comfortable. And when the system stopped knowing what to do with him, he kept moving anyway, even when the road no longer had clear signs. Reducing him to an eccentric character would fall short. Explaining him only through basketball would too. Rodman was the result of a constant collision between extreme talent and a desperate need to exist under his own rules. Sometimes that produced greatness, other times damage, and almost never balance. His place in history isn't in an isolated statistic or a viral image. It's in that uncomfortable space where the game needs people like him to win, but never quite knows how to take care of them afterward. Rodman didn't close a circle, he left a mark, and maybe that, in his case, was the most honest thing that could happen. Drop your thoughts in the comments section. This was Hoop Secrets, and I'll see you next time.